Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us. We'll give people a few minutes to filter in before we get started. And while we wait, feel free to drop where you're joining us from in the chat. Squamish, BC. Oh, another Squamish, BC. Oh, what Abbotsford? We've got lots from BC so far. So, welcome, guys. It's nice and early for you. North Carolina, Winnipeg, another North Carolina. Oh, a few North Carolina. Welcome, guys.
Congratulations to everybody in North Carolina for the Hurricanes Stanley Cup
Yes,
win.
true. Yes, very true. Few from Ontario. All right, we'll just get started now as people filter in. So, my name is Taya Latulip, and I'm the Director of Patient and Caregiver Services at CLFC. Today, we're excited to be facilitating a webinar about PCS and executive functioning. So before I jump in, I'll give a brief introduction of Concussion Legacy Foundation Canada. So it was founded in 2012 to advance the study, treatment, and prevention of the effects of brain trauma associated and associated mental health implications in Canadian athletes, military personnel, youth, and other at-risk groups. And we're proud to have served thousands of Canadians in person and millions online. Our goal today is to help you develop a clear understanding about executive functioning and PCS. And to support this, we're joined by Dr. Brendan Hoffe. So Dr. Brendan Hoffe is the Director of Knowledge Mobilization. I can't speak today, guys. Director of Knowledge Mobilization here at CLFC. He received his PhD in neuroscience from Carleton University in 2024, where his work focused on the cellular changes that take place within the hours after brain impact. His research has been published in several peer-reviewed journals and presented at both national and international conferences, and he's passionate about explaining the complexities of the brain and shares his fascination through accessible, engaging education. Outside of work, Brennan is a member of several sports leagues around the city of Ottawa, and he's passionate about making the sports he enjoys safer for everyone. He also has a 4.5-year-old black lab who keeps him busy and is almost always looking for attention. So you may see her in the background at some point. And today he's here to share about PCS and executive functioning. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please be sure to drop them in the Q&A box so we can address them. And following his presentation, we'll share some additional resources offered by the organization to help you during your recovery. Brendan, if you want to take it away.
Sure. Thank you, Taya. And unfortunately, my little girl Ellie is at summer camp for the past few weeks, so she won't be making an appearance today, but that's okay. Okay, so let me just get situated here and we'll start things going. Do-do-do-do-do. All right. So we are ready to go. All right. So welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the second webinar in our post-concussion community learning series. As Taya mentioned, my name is Brendan Hoffe, and I'm the Director of Knowledge Mobilization here at the Concussion Legacy Foundation. And today we're going to be diving into the topic of executive functioning, a topic many of you have told us you feel particularly frustrated with following a concussion. So just to go over a quick roadmap of what we're going to be covering today, we'll start by defining what exactly is executive functioning and what it matter or why it matters in your daily life. We'll look at the concept of cognitive load, which is really about your brain's working capacity and what you can do with that. From there, we'll look to explore the concept of pacing and planning, and how this applies specifically to people recovering from a concussion or living with post-concussion syndrome. And we'll close out with some kind of take-home strategies that you may have heard about, or maybe you haven't, and you can start incorporating them into your day-to-day life to help with things. So, what exactly is executive functioning? You want to think of it as you want to think of it as the brain's command center, or really the top-down systems that oversee, direct, and coordinate everything that you do. It's a collection of higher order cognitive processes that are deeply involved in how you navigate your daily life. This includes very abstract things like being able to think outside or future stuff and being able to reason about things as well. So, as I mentioned, it's involved in future planning, so thinking ahead to what needs to happen tomorrow or next week. It includes coordinating multiple things at once, so paying attention to what matters and also filtering out what doesn't matter. And importantly, executive functioning also is what helps to suppress impulses. That moment when you know you're not, that moment where you know you shouldn't be really saying something, or you kind of reach for a snack when you know you shouldn't, your executive functioning is what really puts the brakes on and kind of controls those impulses. Now, interestingly, the frontal regions of your brain, where executive functioning largely lives, is the last part of your brain to develop. And in most people, this area of your brain, the frontal cortex, doesn't fully develop or mature until about your mid to late 20s. So it's this sophisticated late blooming system that makes it particularly vulnerable to impacts during development or just overall. So, as we look to executive functioning and what it means, we can break it down into key subcomponents. We're going to go over those now. So, the first is what's known as working memory. It's your brain's short-term holding space. It's what you use to remember or a phone number long enough to dial it, or a grocery list that you keep in your head as you run into the store and grab some stuff. It's the temporary, limited, and effort-dependent uh, memory that you are able to hold. The second is task switching. So this is kind of self-explanatory, and it's that the ability to shift focus from one task to another smoothly. For example, you might be moving from answering an email to answering a text message to responding to a phone call of some kind, and then back again. After a concussion, or individuals that have post-concussion syndrome might find this switching between tasks rather jarring or just mentally exhaustive. The third is, as I mentioned in the previous slide, your inhibitory control, your ability to suppress habitual or automatic responses in something that's more appropriate. So, as I mentioned, avoiding sweets when you're trying to eat well is a simple example for this. And fourth, when it comes to the subcomponents of executive functioning, is this higher level ordering. This is the big picture stuff. Think multitasking, future planning, exercising good judgment, and prioritizing tasks. Things like planning to book a restaurant next week that is better than this one for whatever reason that you might have in terms of prioritizing or judgment, or working towards long-term goals. This is where a lot of post-concussion syndrome patients feel that they've lost something. And a common thing that's constantly heard is this idea of, I just can't think the way that I used to. Now, if you were with us in the previous webinar series, I described a key network involved in the cognitive domain of symptoms, and that comes from the task positive network, which largely revolves and relies on the idea of executive functioning. You may remember that this is the brain network that's active when you're alert and attention, or you're in attention demanding tasks. And also from last time, as the neuroscience perspective of things and kind of looking at the neurology of it, executive functioning involves largely, for the most part, the frontal lobe, which is indicated in the white portion on this image here, or the more anterior brain, so the front of your brain, and its connections to the downstream regions. Now, let's talk about two important frameworks that help us understand how executive function works in practice, okay? So the first is this kind of top-down, bottom-up cycle in play. The brain regions responsible for executive function, referred to as cortical, again, being like the front part of your brain, just keep that in mind, are deeply interconnected with regions that manage your emotions as well as your automatic or autonomic processes, such as like the amygdala, and those are referred to as subcortical or below cortical or below these regions. This means your cognitive function and your emotional state are constantly influencing one another based on activity. So if you're anxious, your executive function takes a hit. If your executive function reserves or resources get depleted, emotional regulation becomes harder. The second is what's known as the inverted U function, which I think captures something rather intuitively. Executive function relies on physiological arousal for the level of alertness and activation that you're experiencing, but it's not always the case of more is better. If your arousal is too low, you're kind of bored, you're sluggish, you might be unfocused in a task. However, on the flip side, if it's too high, that can lead you to feeling overwhelmed or anxious or stressed because of all this. So the sweet spot is somewhere in the middle. And if you remember from the previous webinar series that I gave last time, this is what I referred to as the Goldilocks principle in neuroscience. Not too much, not too little, just right. And this is critically relevant for post-concussion syndrome because this condition can push you into either end of that curve, right? And oftentimes it's into the chronic high arousal, which then undermines your cognitive capabilities. Now, with all this said and done, let's kind of layer in this concept of cognitive load that I've mentioned a few times, okay? So, simply put, cognitive load is how much mental capacity you have available to manage information and execute tasks at any given time. So, this theory of cognitive load breaks down into four concepts that we'll cover. First, there's your working memory demands, or how much effort your brain has to put in to hold on to that information in the space in your head and manipulate that information with what requires in the cognitive task. Second is what's known as intrinsic cognitive load. That is the mental network that is, or sorry, the mental work directly required by the task itself at hand. Doing something complex and cognitively demanding, like writing a report or attending a large amount of meetings in a day or troubleshooting a technical problem, has high intrinsic cognitive load. The third concept is what's known as extraneous cognitive load. This is all the mental activity that's consuming resources but isn't productive to the task at hand. Think noisy environment or intrusive thoughts or having to split your attention between tasks. All of these kind of activities are using up your cognitive fuel that you have without actually helping you get anything done related to the task. And finally, we have the idea of cognitive overload, which is when the combination of intrinsic and extraneous demands exceed your capacity to work or to be able to hold on to this information. This is the state where things start to break down when it comes to fatigue or what we'll talk about later on. So, with all this kind of neuropsychology and really psychology kind of explanations out there that I've talked about, we arrive at this critical question when it comes to the neuroscience of things. Why does executive function and cognitive load management take such a significant hit after concussion or after when you have post-concussion syndrome? The answer really lies in the anatomy of the brain. So the frontal cortex, remember, our command center, late blooming or late developing, has some of the highest white matter density in the entire brain. Now, if this is your first time hearing the term white matter, or you're not really sure about what it actually is, think of it as a component to the wiring in your brain. It's what a component that makes up the cables within your brain that carry signals between the regions of your brain. The command center, as you can kind of already tell, needs a lot of these cables because it has to communicate with virtually everything in the brain to some degree. So when a TBI or concussion takes place, all that stretching or shearing or compression, all those forces cause the cables in your white matter to be microscopically torn. Those connections then become disrupted. And maybe think of it as like or what happens when you cut a phone line. The device is still there, but the signal can't get through reliably, okay? Now, modern brain imaging has done enormous amounts for transforming our understanding of post-concussion syndrome. What we now see in patients is that the brain is working significantly harder than a healthy brain to perform the same tasks. There's increased blood flow to regions responsible for executive functioning and increased energy demands, which just means the brain is recruiting extra resources just to keep up with the day-to-day activities. Researchers refer to post-concussion syndrome as a disorder of brain connectivity for cognitive tasks for that reason. In essence, the system is no longer efficient and it's running on less capable networks and compensating this by working overtime to just be at normal state of functioning, right? And here's the critical implication. This is largely invisible to the outside, and we recognize that. You might look completely fine to others, but internally, what's going on in your brain, it's burning through cognitive resources and reserves at a faster rate than it should be. And the result, mental fatigue that sets in a lot earlier than you're used to. Now, as I walk through this next slide, maybe reflect if this scenario has ever happened to you in your initial stages of recovery or something that you experience in your day-to-day life with post-concussion syndrome. It goes like this. Pre-concussion, you have a typical ability to work your brain a lot. Maybe you're a workaholic, or you socialized a lot, or really enjoy reading a book for long periods of time. Post-injury, however, you push yourself to return to your pre-injury level of activity or work. You ignore those warning signs like the headache creeping in or the mental fog and the irritability. You can't see the injury, so you push through this in your head. This is what's referred to as pushing into the danger zone. And then, because of the push, the crash inevitably happens by a sudden surge in symptoms. Those might be mental, they might be physical or emotional symptoms that you're experiencing. You're knocked back significantly. And this is what's known as the mental crash phase, as indicated through the downward trajectory on this graph here. And then this crash pushes you into this extended rest period, sometimes for days, just to recover from that overexertion that you might have experienced, which then creates its own frustration because the recovery just keeps getting delayed. This kind of boom bust cycle of what you're experiencing is incredibly common. And it's one of the main reasons why post-concussion syndrome can drag on for long periods of time. So, how do we kind of break this cycle? And this is where the concept of panic, or sorry, this is where the concept of pacing and planning kind of come into play. So, pacing if you haven't heard, is all about how you budget your energy and budget your cognitive abilities. You have a finite amount of this kind of cognitive fuel, if you will, each day, and pacing is about how you spend that fuel effectively, rather than spending it all at once in the first half of your day and then running on empty by the afternoon. Planning, on the other hand, is about being intentional and proactive with what you do. Rather than waiting until you hit that wall or the symptoms start to set in and then resting, you schedule those rest periods in advance. You build them into your day as non-negotiable appointments. This is called deliberate restriction. So these images on the screen that you'll see here illustrate the concept of pacing visually over time. This change in safe zone size from the previous graph on the screen is the result of this buildup over time. So avoiding that danger zone and working within those limits. The goal here is to stay within your safe zone or stay at the top of your safe zone and kind of uh, improve your abilities to work with your cognition and stay below the threshold that the trigger or that the threshold that triggers your symptoms to surge. The green zone on the diagram is where your healing happens and where you can kind of feel the progress that you're going to be making. The red zone above it is where this crash cycle begins to set in. So over time, you might be able to slightly dip into those mild symptoms, the mild symptom territories, but it's important to recognize that threshold and then ease off what it is that you're doing. But this takes a long time to build up. Now, if you're someone that prefers circles for imagery, this image is the same concept that we've been talking about for the past few slides. The green is what you used to be able to do pre-post-concussion syndrome, where you could manage a large cognitive load. However, the post-concussion life that you've now entered has put you into this yellow area, a limit of what you used to be able to do. The red in this image kind of represents this area where you can slightly push yourself. So if you remember from the previous graph, it would be at the top of that safe zone that I'm talking about here. Each day you extend your abilities, and that causes the yellow circle to grow over time. In an ideal world, this yellow becomes the green circle. However, this might not be the case for everyone, and it's important to recognize the day-to-day achievements that you experience and the little progressions to keep pushing that yellow circle just outward as you go. It might not fully return to the full green circle that you see here, but you have to remember that your brain is also changing over time naturally as it's healing. So your abilities from before will be changing as well. Now, if you were with us in the previous webinar, I mentioned that fatigue is a result of an energy imbalance in your brain and how the chemistry of your brain becomes altered through what's known as hyperexcitability or too much activity, or on the flip side, disruption or depletion of your brain neurochemistry. You can kind of use this previous knowledge that I mentioned and apply it to what we've seen so far with hyperactivity or disruption and depletion of your reserves. So, research has consistently shown that post-concussion syndrome patients fatigue cognitively at a significantly faster rate than non-injured individuals performing the same tasks. And when the brain fatigues, it starts to go into this suboptimal processing and becomes less adaptable, less able to make these switches when it comes to what tasks you're doing, and less capable of suppressing repetitive or unhelpful thought patterns. Daily cognitive activities that a non-injured brain can support place a disproportionate toll on the post-concussion syndrome brain. And this creates a vicious cycle, this kind of cognitive dysfunction that makes the emotional regulation harder to do. The prefrontal cortex, or again, the command center, normally keeps the amygdala or these subcortical regions in check. But when it's under strain, emotional regulation starts to weaken. This can lead to irritability and anxiety, which then increases arousal and then kind of puts into this idea of extraneous and intrinsic cognitive load and cognitive overload, which then makes the fatigue worse in a self-reinforcing loop. So, what does the research actually tell us about the right approach to activity during recovery? Let's just look at one study, for example, okay? This was a rather large study of roughly or about 335 patients after an emergency room clinic visit. And this is what we're going to be looking at, okay? So participants were monitored across several weeks for symptoms and reported their level of cognitive activity on a scale of 0 to 4. Level 0 was complete rest. No reading, no screens, no texting, nothing. Complete rest. Level 4, on the flip side, was full activity, no restrictions, basically ignoring everything. Now, you can maybe already see where the story is kind of going from what we've talked about so far, is that the results were pretty clear and predictive that the level 4 group, those who just carried on as normal and kind of ignored all the stuff and had no restrictions on their level of activity, took significantly longer to recover compared to the other groups. Now, interestingly, and this is kind of the equally important part as well, that patients who engaged in some level of cognitive activity, even modest amounts in this study, recovered along similar trajectories to those who rested in that level 0 group. This kind of dismantles this idea of, or like the old advice that therapists used to give out, and just because we didn't know any better, that the complete cognitive rest idea is not all that it used to be, or not as beneficial as it thought. Some mental engagement during recovery is actually beneficial. And again, if you remember from the previous session, I kind of talked about how you can go and do like Sudoku books or crosswords or word searches or these mental gymnastic games to help with this recovery and help with this moderate to mild cognitive abilities. It's fairly accessible to everyone. You can go down to a dollar store and pick up a Sudoku book for $2 of something. So, and still have the benefits of what is being performed. The goal isn't to do nothing in this circumstance. It's to do the right amount of, it's to do the right amount that works for you. So, as we begin to kind of wind down this talk today, let's look at some possible things that you can take home from this. Again, this is not medical advice, but rather advice that you can share peer to peer. Maybe you've heard about what I've described or what I'll be describing, or maybe you haven't, but it's worth a try to see how these techniques can work for you, and they're very deliberate. The first is kind of the simple one to keep in your mind. It's about keeping yourself in this safe zone as you walk through recovery. Stay below the symptom threshold. This isn't about doing as little as possible. It's about doing as much as you can without the triggering of symptoms and the surge of symptoms, and also recognizing that limit and being able to see where those things lie. When you take breaks from staying in the safe zone, make them active rests rather than passive ones, okay? So try avoiding doing nothing, as inactivity, as we have shown in the previous slide from that study, isn't always restorative and sometimes can increase mental restlessness. So take, for example, you just got off a meeting, a very cognitively demanding meeting, or you're doing a task that's very cognitively demanding. If you were just to go from, let's say, 70% of your ability to 0 by just doing nothing, that wind down can be a lot more difficult for your brain to kind of ease into this state of active rest. Instead, try light movement. Get up, do some stretching, go get a glass of water, or listen to low stimulation music or a low stimulation podcast, or, if you have one, pet your dog. This again kind of comes back to the idea of this Goldilocks principle in neuroscience that we've talked about a couple times now. The goal is to gently sustain a calm, moderate level of engagement that allows your brain to recover without completely going offline, and also being able to recognize that process when it's happening. Some days might be better than others, but it's important to not lose the forest through the trees here. Or in other ways, not to lose sight of the gains that you've made over time just because of one loss that you've experienced. So, one of the frameworks that you can take away um, from this and kind of maybe utilize this moving forward is the three P's of strategy described by the Fowler Kennedy Clinic in London, Ontario. The first one that we've talked about is planning. So take time the night before and map out what needs to happen for the next day. Crucially, schedule your active rest periods in advance so that it's not an afterthought when the symptoms hit. You want to be intentional with this and use physical cues and reminders. So set a timer, use sticky notes, whatever works for you, just make it deliberate. Next is prioritizing. Accept that your cognitive bandwidth is limited right now because it is. You may not be able to accomplish everything on your list, and that's okay. A little is genuinely more than nothing in the circumstance. Think about the energy commitment of each task and decide on which ones matter the most to do. That's prioritizing. And last is pacing. Break larger tasks into smaller chunks and spread them across multiple sessions or even days if it has to be. Something useful to keep in mind is also to switch between different types of tasks. A high cognitive task, such as like reading for a long period of time or writing a lot or attending a lot of meetings, should be followed up by a low level physical activity like a short walk or stretching so that you use different parts of your brain and you give your executive systems that kind of partial rest it needs. Now, I want to introduce you to a kind of specific time management technique that is both evidence-based and particularly well suited for post-concussion syndrome recovery. And that's what's known as the Pomodoro Technique. And the name comes from what you see on the screen here, the tomato-shaped kitchen timer. Now, I don't speak Italian, but apparently Pomodoro is Italian for tomato. This technique was actually developed by an Italian med student in the mid 80s, I believe. So, broadly speaking, the technique works like this. You work in focused 25-minute intervals, followed by a short 5-minute break. After four of these cycles, you take a longer break that might be 15 to 30 minutes in length. But during each interval, the goal is limited distractions. Put your phone away, put it on airplane mode or do not disturb. You want your environment to be quiet, or for me personally, when I'm doing this kind of stuff, low stimulation music, kind of piano, kind of acoustic music to keep something in there. And the time is tracked externally. And this is crucial for this by a tomato timer, if you have one, if you want to follow the technique one to one, or really an app, a watch, whatever works for you, as long as it's external. And the key is that the structure comes from outside your executive functioning system. And that's essentially taking a task away from an already compromised system. So research from you're using the Pomodoro technique in post-concussion syndrome patients, comparing it to the unstructured kind of self-regulated sessions shows that it lowers overall fatigue, it steadies concentration and motivation over longer periods of time, and reduces distractedness. And these are outcomes that we're kind of looking for when it comes to post-concussion syndrome recovery. Now, that's a great place to start and kind of introduce you to this time management technique and like active rests and being deliberate with your kind of cognitive abilities. But this, as the standard Pomodoro Pomodoro Technique is powerful to begin with, it does have a limitation that's brought up. It's fairly rigid, and you can kind of see that 25 minutes on, 5 minutes off, regardless of how you're actually feeling or performing. In practice, energy levels aren't as predictable, and I'm sure you've experienced that as they might vary from day to day or even hour to hour. There's also this concept in psychology known as flow, or this state of deep immersive concentration when your performance peaks. Rigidly stopping every 25 minutes can actually disrupt those flow states when they do occur. So another version that I've come across online and kind of looked at the research and I guess vetted, if you will. And I'll provide a link to a YouTube video that does a very good job of kind of summarizing everything and kind of putting it into practice in the slides when we share them afterwards, is what's known as the progressive Pomodoro technique. It's a step above the standard technique. In short, it builds in a shorter initial interview or initial interval, sorry, kind of like a warm up, if you will, where you're first starting out and not fully in the zone yet. It allows for the idea of override. So if you're genuinely in this kind of deep focus state and your timer goes off, you're allowed to keep going as you're in that productive groove as long as you kind of work within your means and capabilities and don't go into that symptom triggering crash out. It also allows for gradual escalation, starting with shorter blocks, so maybe 5 minutes or 10 minutes instead of that rigid 25, and progressively increasing to maybe 30, 40, 60 minutes as your tolerance builds and you work within what you're able to do. And that changes day to day as well. And also, the breaks are proportionate to the interval rather than fixed. So, if you do a 5 minute session, you only take a 1 minute break. Or if you do a 60-minute session, maybe you need a 45-minute break. Just it works with you. So, this approach respects the reality that recovery is not linear, right? And that on your good days, you are able to do a little bit more. But on those harder days, you're able to pull back, and that's okay. The structure adapts to you rather than the other way around. So, this brings us to the end of today's session. And thank you so much for giving me your time and attention to explain some of this stuff, especially since sustained attention is genuinely costly for individuals that are suffering from post-concussion syndrome. I really do appreciate that. If there's one thing that I want you to take away from today's session is that your brain is working a lot harder than it looks. Give it the time and give it the grace and the structure that it needs to heal. Rest intentionally, plan proactively, and be patient with yourself. Recovery is a process, it's not just a single event. So, if you'd like some more information on support, I'd encourage you to visit our resources at the Concussion Legacy Foundation Canada through the link on the screen. We'll also share this stuff afterwards. We also have a helpline as a very valuable resource that Taya and Abby will be linking all these resources that are free for you in the chat and also in all the follow-ups that we're going to pass down. So, thank you, everybody, again for attending this webinar series. I hope you maybe learned something or are able to take away something from this. I hope everyone has a great weekend, and I'm happy to take some questions now and kind of talk about some stuff. So thank you.
Thank you, Brendan, for that great presentation. I will share screen and go through some of the questions. If you guys have questions, drop them in the Q&A. I see some already. I'll go by which ones have had the most upvotes. So the first question, Brendan, is for pacing and planning, how do you handle it if you're not ever fully symptom-free?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Definitely a
So,
tricky one.
whoops, sorry. I think it's kind of getting back to maybe like square one, I think it might be the case when it comes to if you're not completely symptom free or being able to kind of work in that like upper green zone of that graph, if you remember, where do as much as you can but also recognizing that maybe you have a lingering headache, but you're still able to maybe do some work. It just might mean that your pacing is a lot shorter than what you'd expect. So maybe you looking at it in the way of like a 5 minute cognitive session followed by a break, a 5 minute cognitive session followed by a break, something that works for you in this case. So it's important to recognize that it's not entirely symptom free, especially at the starting stages of things, but it's your ability to work with what you know you can do and kind of being able to recognize those processes.
Thank you, Brendan. Someone said they're 4 years into PCS and they were making improvements, but then they hit perimenopause and now feels like the gains have been lost. How much do hormones impact PCS and will executive functioning improve this time?
Yeah, so that kind of goes to the real like soup of it all and the like neurochemistry of it when you start to add hormones in. And again, it's this kind of concept of like the brain and body is changing over time. So what you might experience like 10 years ago, like in this case, like premenopausal, might not be the case and post or in this kind of postmenopausal state. So, and again, I'm not an expert when it comes to like hormones and menopause and all that kind of stuff. So this is just speculative, but it's I wouldn't necessarily say that executive functioning goes away because, like, the executive functioning, again, is this kind of top-down process, right? And it's this kind of, it's in the background of a lot of the stuff that you do naturally. So, to you're able to work within the means and able to do kind of simple tasks and being able to incorporate like these cognitive ability tests that I've talked about, like Sudoku and stuff like that, um, to help you with the symptoms that you might be experiencing or as your brain ages. But to add in hormones into the whole mix, it really kind of gets into the messy part of neuroscience where it's not cut and dry. There might be some uh, experts that you can talk to about the incorporation of hormones into like day-to-day life. But in terms of my expertise, I can't really touch on the influence of hormones just because it gets so messy at that point. But I we can maybe try and find some resources, or we can look towards having maybe someone as a guest speaker who speaks to hormones at a later point.
Thanks, Brendan. Someone shared that it took them a number of years to figure out this zone, wish they had learned it early in their journey. Just sharing that because a bunch of people upvoted that. Um, Sonia said, I had my first concussion at 20 years old. Are the impacts different on the brain in PCS if you're still in development based on age?
Yeah, so it, I would say yes, because it's kind of like you're putting, if your early 20s, you're starting to get into that kind of like plateau of development with the frontal lobe or the frontal regions of your brain and like the prefrontal cortex and stuff like that. But it kind of, when you're a lot younger, your ability to kind of heal and adapt because your brain is already being in development, it can take a lot, but it that's also to a certain extent, right? It can't take everything, but when you start to get into this kind of late, mid, early 20s kind of area where the development kind of plateaus, it does have a risk of the connections already being formed. But again, you have to remember that the brain is plastic, and that's a very common term that you might hear in like the neuroscience world, where it does have the ability to remold and kind of put those connections back together. It just might take a lot longer if you're at a later stage in your life or even at a later stage of development. And that's what's kind of the not so great thing about the late development of it is because of how it's able to like mold and reshape itself, but it's also at that window where it starts to solidify at your kind of like early to mid 20s.
Thanks, Brendan. We had two questions about emotional responses. Someone had said, would this explain having different or more dramatic emotional responses to things? And then kind of going together was, how can you rebuild your ability to be emotional and have hard conversations with people?
Mm. Yeah, so I'll answer the first one in terms of the kind of connectivity between the brain regions. So if you remember from what we kind of talked about, the amygdala in like kind of the center of your brain is really the emotion center hub of your brain. And that's kind of where a lot of emotions start and processing takes place. And that has a very, very strong connection with the prefrontal cortex, or kind of the very front of of your brain, in that they work in tandem with each other. So the prefrontal cortex plays a lot in kind of regulating and making sure that amygdala doesn't override itself, because it wants to go all the time. It's a very emotionally or very pattern learning center of your brain. So it is constantly going, but the prefrontal cortex kind of puts the brakes on that region. So if you have an executive function, like I talked about with the suppression of impulses, it plays a big role in your ability to kind of regulate your emotions, because it's kind of putting those brakes on the amygdala. Now, if you have dysfunction or kind of disruption to the prefrontal cortex, you can picture it as like the brakes starting to come off of that amygdala's activity while the car is still rolling. So it's going to be moving forward, it's going to be active, but the brakes are starting to come off. And that's what causes the amygdala to really start to activate and can lead to some emotional disruptions and disturbances. And unfortunately, I can't remember. I don't have the working memory going on this. So what was the second
No
question?
worries. I realized afterwards I should have done them separate. How can you rebuild your ability to be emotional and have hard conversations?
Yeah, so that's a tricky question, because that kind of gets into a bit of counseling in terms of and that's, I feel like, where my expertise kind of stretches. But I would say, like from a neuroscience perspective, being able to work your frontal lobe with like executive functioning tasks and being able to perform cognitively to some degree will help, like indirectly, with that kind of stuff. Now, you can't really kind of it's not like a one trick pony, and it takes a lot of time to develop these kinds of things. But doing small things from a neuroscience perspective leads to larger kind of progress over a grand scheme of things. But in terms of like what you can actually do practically, like I said, I feel like gets into like a counseling kind of area that I don't have the knowledge to speak on.
Thanks, Brendan. Someone asked, do you have any resources for planning and pacing and knowing where your safe zone and danger zones are?
Yeah, so this is kind of a bit of like a self-reflection question, or a self-reflection kind of journey that you need to partake in. And it is also a standardized technique, right? This whole idea about pacing and planning, where you want to be deliberate with what you're doing, and you want to be writing everything down and making sure that what you're doing is actually working for you. Now, this is kind of just like the general guidelines of things, but it really is kind of like a self-exploration way of approaching your recovery, because no recoveries are going to be the same. No brains are the same. So, to say about what you could possibly do, I would maybe start with maybe if you're early in your recovery or kind of struggling with your recovery, write down a lot of stuff. And I did this even before, like before, and a lot of what I did with like grad school is I would be able to, if I found something emotionally disturbing, or if I had troubles with concentrations or stuff like that, I would deliberately write down what I did, how I felt and kept track so that when it comes to you're feeling this again, you can maybe look back on what you have. The brain does a lot for pattern recognition. So maybe being able to recognize, like, okay, I'm doing this task. I've worked on it for like 5 minutes, or I've planned it so that I take breaks and stuff like that. It could increase your ability to kind of work with what you know work with what you know is going on within you through deliberately writing stuff down. That might be a good place to start.
And then another great resource would be working with an occupational therapist.
Mhm.
You can reach out to the helpline, which we'll share later, and we can help refer some occupational therapists who are knowledgeable about concussion and PCS.
For sure.
They can be a great resource. Is it common for what gets you in the red zone to be different day to day, and how do you accommodate that day to day with planning?
Yeah, so that's kind of this idea that I was talking about with like the progressive Pomodoro technique, right? Where it's like your like like let's just use this as an example where the energy and like this kind of abstract thought, speaking of which, of like cognitive reserves and cognitive fuel, that's going to change like day to day. So let's use your energy that you're able to do on like a Monday morning when you're working is going to be a lot different than, let's say, a Wednesday or Thursday afternoon. So your ability to kind of adapt to that stuff and recognizing that it might be pushing into this red zone at any given point. Again, kind of goes back to this. You need to be able to recognize these stuff over time. So starts with writing down symptoms or writing down feelings and kind of recognizing and seeing those patterns develop. But when it comes to the day-to-day aspect of it, it really depends on how you're feeling. And also, maybe it is like that block doesn't work for you where you've worked for 10 minutes and or 15 minutes, but your symptoms are starting to set in. Maybe it is like adjusting on the fly. And that's where this like progressive Pomodoro technique kind of alters stuff to the individual and being able to maybe work for 5 minutes or work for 10 minutes, but then go back to working 5 minutes. I know it's frustrating and it can come off as like not much gains, but working in that safe zone of like where you recognize things are landing is the goal of this objective here.
Someone had a question about how would you work with a personal trainer to use the Pomodoro method to help them prevent overload with a teen who cannot read their own cues for when they need to take a rest?
Right. That's a good question, and that might come down to having a conversation with the personal trainer and being like open with like your recovery because it's kind of important that like, and we'll talk about this when we have an expert on like workplace and stuff like that, but telling other individuals that you're working with or that you're training with that you're working in a limited capacity. So that might be through accommodations that they'll know, but being upfront and open about this kind of stuff does go a long way. And also the acceptance of that kind of like invisible injury kind of notion that we've talked about where you're feeling it internally, but you don't know how to emphasize that to someone else or explain that to someone else. So maybe just talking to your personal trainer as my advice about, hey, I can't do this for the 10 minutes that you're asking. So just maybe starting there might be some good advice.
Final question. If you've overdone it in the last week, should you rest and catch up the next week to get back on track?
Yeah, so that kind of goes into this like cyclical, like steep incline, steep decline, and kind of overexertion. And also the idea of active rest. So if you've overexerted yourself and kind of need to take like the time away, I wouldn't necessarily say doing nothing and completely resting and then going back and doing whatever it is that you were doing is a very productive technique, you need to work with your efficiency, right? So if you've overexerted yourself, again, recognize that you've overexerted yourself, see what caused that, and then kind of slowly increase your ability to work rather than go right back to it. But in that kind of resting period, you shouldn't be doing nothing. Like it's kind of going back to that notion of doing something little means a lot more than nothing. So doing Sudoku, getting these brain games activated at a very comfortable pace will be a lot more beneficial in the long run compared to just kind of resting. So you doing that kind of do nothing rest is not as progressive as we've once thought it was. So light cognitive activities will go a long way in that resting period if you've overexerted yourself.
Thanks, Brendan. That's all the time we have for the Q&A. Thank you everyone for your questions and for engaging in the Q&A. And thank you, Brendan, for such an informative presentation. We're looking forward to our next session next month for sure. Before we close out today's webinar, I want to take a moment to share a few resources we have available at CLFC. So the CLF Helpline supports Canadians by providing personalized help to those struggling with the outcomes of brain injury. If you are a loved one or seeking guidance on how to choose the right doctor, managing lingering symptoms, seeking provider recommendations, or have any other questions, submit your request at the link in the chat. A dedicated member of our team will follow up with you. We also host a couple weekly and monthly support groups for patients and caregivers navigating persistent post-concussion symptoms and suspected CTE. If you are looking for one-on-one peer support, we also have a one-on-one program that connects you with a trained volunteer with lived experience. All those links will be in the chat. And if you want to follow us on social media, the links are listed on the screen, and Abby will also be adding them in the chat as well. And finally, on behalf of Concussion Legacy Foundation Canada, thank you all for joining us today. Our next monthly post-concussion learning series will be on Friday, July 17th from 10 to 11 a.m. Eastern. And we will also be hosting a follow-up discussion about this topic next Thursday, June 25th from 10 to 11 a.m. Eastern. And the registration link will be in the chat. And if you want to be the first to learn about future events like this, sign up for our newsletter using the link in the chat as well. And you will receive a recording of today's session to the email you registered with early next week. And you will also get the slide deck as well. Thank you all for joining us today, and I hope you guys all have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks, everyone. See you next week or next session.
Yes.